Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the Masculine Wilderness Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Perez, and I am the founder and CEO of Epic Project. This podcast is an ongoing conversation for men and the women that care about them. And today is, I feel very sentimental about today's conversation because I get to introduce to all of you my oldest friend. She's not old. My oldest friend in this work. We're joined today by Elizabeth Scaife, who has a long history in the work against commercial sexual exploitation, sex trafficking, child sex trafficking. It's been called a whole lot of things. And in a lot of ways, she's my historian in this work because she has seen it over a long period of time. And I'm just really excited. I'll share more about kind of how our paths crossed initially. But Elizabeth, welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing right now, which is an organization called Find Your North Global. But tell us a little bit about yourself. And I have a long list of questions that I want to pick your brain on.
Okay. Well, it's a joy and a pleasure to be here. I never get tired of hearing you say that little tagline for our relationship, Tom, that I'm your oldest friend in the human trafficking field. It warms my heart literally every time you say it. I'm so proud.
You're still a puppy, but go ahead.
I'm so proud. I run Fin Global, and it is a small business dedicated to big ideas, as I like to say sometimes. I support the ongoing missions of survivors and allies worldwide. So I like to take their mission and help them accomplish it more strategically, more efficiently with strategic planning, focus on sustainability, looking for greater impact. So my career has been in the nonprofit sector, and I have a lot of love and compassion for the struggles that literally every single nonprofit faces. There's all the same pitfalls. We're all aiming for the same great impact for a reason that, motivated us or mobilized us to be involved at a ground level. And so I always say, nonprofits in particular are not started by executive business leaders. They're started by program directors who wanted to be a part of something, and they begin this organization to create the impact, right? And to rally the support for this cause. And then they find themselves having to learn to do all the other things that's not their natural gifting, but they have to do them by default. And so I really understand that because that's how I'm wired as well. Yeah. But having worked in the field for so long, in a career of nonprofits of different kinds, and then the anti-trafficking field specifically for 15 years now, then I understand those struggles. And so I like to dedicate my time to serving no longer the missions of just one organization, but countless, and helping them accomplish them more strategically.
I have two early memories of just our engagement in this work, and it was a long time ago. I was working for a brief season with Shared Hope International. It's one of the oldest anti-trafficking groups around, as were you. And two things stuck out to me that were, I think, for me, really formative. One was we went, there was a team of us that met in Chicago for a press conference and a series of meetings. Mm-hmm. Remember that?
Yes.
And it was all over, and I'm from that area. So when we went, I stayed with my folks, and I think you came to visit or came over for dinner or something. I was there with my folks. I just remember, I don't even remember the conversation, but I remember standing there in my parents' driveway, just talking with you, debriefing about the event and the experience and all of that. And we were, a little bit of commiserating because I don't think it went like we thought it would. But what I remember about that was here is a trusted friend, and she also happens to be a woman. Mm-hmm. And that was relatively new for me. Now that's certainly how it's my relationship with my wife, and I've always understood that, but it had been very rare to have someone that I felt like I was, kind of running alongside, and that she was a woman. So that stuck out to me, and that is a pattern that has been repeated, and I'm really blessed over and over again in the last, almost 20 years that I've been doing this. That was the first thing that I remember about you. Second thing was a conversation we had in the upstairs office of the old Vancouver office for Shared Hope International. Again, I don't remember what the meeting was about, but I was invited to sit in on it. And it was you and Linda Smith and Melissa Snow and Samantha Vardaman. So the senior leadership for Shared Hope. Again, what I remember was I felt like it was a scene in a movie where we were in the war room and all of the generals were talking together about a plan. And I'm just like, I felt like I was a, 250-pound fly on the wall, just watching you guys work. And I remember that what impressed me was the quality of leadership that existed in that space. And I think I'm pretty sure I've shared that story before on this podcast with other guests, but like you were there, you were one of the generals. And again, so what formed me was the relationship, the trusted friendship, and to see the strength of leadership that women were bringing, that they had already been bringing to this work. And I felt like, man, men are showing up late to this fight. So those are the two things that stuck out to me. My first question for you is, how, prior to that, that scene, like, well, how did you get into this? What drew you into this work? How did you get to that? How'd you get to my parents' driveway? What drew you into it?
Yeah, wow, great question. I used to tell this story a lot. When I first got into the field, that was kind of the burgeoning question back then that we used to ask each other was, how did you get here?
Yeah.
Yeah, I had, prior to trafficking work, I did a lot of nonprofit work. And so I was consistently working on projects domestically and internationally, and had a huge heart for just marginalized populations, even though I wouldn't have even labeled it as such back then. But I care about people, and I especially cared about hurting people and wanted to make the world a better place. That was always kind of how I was wired growing up. Over time, that led me into, I was traveling in 2007 for almost a year. I was traveling the world in my younger days with a group of other volunteers, and we were popping around to different countries, kind of supporting initiatives that were already existing. And in that time frame, I remember I was leaving Africa and we were heading into Asia, and I had never been to Asia. And the conversation that was happening on our team, because there was another group that we met up with while we were in Africa who had discussed some of what was happening in Thailand in particular. And somebody passed me a book, and it was one of the first books ever written on human trafficking. And it was by Victor Malarak. So Victor, if you're out there, thank you for that, because I don't know if they published the book anymore, but it was called The Natashas. And he actually wrote a second book, which you might be familiar with. He wrote The Johns, which
somewhere behind me on the shelf. Yeah.
Yeah. And mine's down here on my little mini shelf under my desk. But his first book was called The Natashas, and he was an investigative journalist, and it was a deeply revolting, and it was the kind of book that turns your blood cold, right? Like in its expose on the global issue of, in particular, sex trafficking, that book was. And so I read that book, and I just was enraptured by it, because it wasn't fiction. He had traveled the world speaking to all of these leaders that were working on this, as well as nonprofits, as well as survivors, and documenting these things. And then I transitioned into Thailand, and I was actually volunteering for an organization for a month in Bangkok that by night they would do outreach at the bars where women were employed in prostitution. And by day, they were inviting women into a program that offered safe housing and economic empowerment. And so I was tutoring English and building relationships with the women, and then I participated in outreach. And so that month was life altering for me. And it wasn't just that part. It was also what I did, which Dave Rogers, if you ever met Dave, he's a retired FBI agent, and he worked on trafficking for many, many years. And I still remember sitting next to him on a couple panels where he would follow up my story and say, guys, don't ever do what she did, right? Which was basically take all the tools I learned in the book and decide for myself that I was going to go find trafficking, because you're surrounded by commercial sex. Right. But as a foreigner, it was really hard to discern, on the spectrum between like trafficking and consensual sex work, where do all these people fall? it's hard to decide, but I ventured out on my own, determined to find very clear, unequivocal examples of trafficking. So in my mind, it was European women brought into Bangkok for that. And the short story is, without getting into it here, I did find them. I found them using all the tools that I learned from Victor in his book on how to do that. And I found them in my own little cavalier, I will rescue you kind of way, and dragged my friend Christy, who's a dear friend of mine, along with me. We told no one. We had no cell phones. No one knew where we were going because I didn't want anybody to tell me I couldn't or I shouldn't, right? And so we located this group of women who were clearly under control. And it was like, in this moment, you suddenly realize you're in a foreign country with no rights. You have no established resources ready to go. You have what are you doing? You thought I literally thought I was going to walk up to them, Tom, just say, hey, I'm here. Let's go, and walk out the door. I literally did. And which is my personality, guys. If that says anything.
Well, yes, I know that. But it's interesting because I have not heard that story. But what's fascinating about it is it's that impulse to do something.
Yeah.
And that is, I've come to believe that is not a gendered thing. Like, men want to do something, but I think you're proof, and I've met so many other women. It's like, no, it's a human response to suffering is to show up and try to do something. And I think that's very typical of you. I'm also curious though, when you read that book, like, what did that do emotionally to you? Like, what was your emotional response when you read that?
I would say outrage, and not just indignance, right? Because as a woman, and this book was in particular about sex trafficking, and it didn't document the stories of men who are also victims of sex trafficking, or even necessarily, it may have covered some transgender, but it was largely about women. And I felt absolute outrage from the fiber of my being that anyone would treat other people this way. Yeah. And that they would get away with it in such like depth and prevalence. And that on the other side of the exploitation were then those who took advantage of it, right? And when you're in Thailand, I don't know if you've been to Thailand yourself, but
I have not.
It is in your face. When I was there, again, I've only been to Thailand once since then, and that's a whole other story, but it was the largest, prostitution was against the law, but the sex industry was the largest industry, from like $1 billion industry in Thailand, even though prostitution was against the law. So it's culturally accepted. The government embraces it because it brings in the tourism dollars. It's one of the largest sex tourism countries in the world, among many other things. And so you're surrounded by this cultural acceptance from the government on it, per se. But at a cultural level, at a ground level, it's frowned upon. And so there's this whole odd just mix of things that are happening. And as a woman looking around for the first time, being overwhelmed with kind of like this sort of Vegas, like lights and neon and in your face, like commercial sex industry, the sheer numbers of men in particular, like Western white men who were business traveling for sex options in Thailand most people, like, they get into trafficking and then over time they learn about demand and maybe they see some demand, but no, I deep end hardcore.
Yeah.
And it broke my heart, right? Like, so, and in that moment that I showed up to rescue those girls, it was devastating to me because I suddenly realized, which was the first time in my life, and I vowed for it to be the last time in my life, that I would show up to a situation in such a way, unprepared, without the resources to do something or to act. And so I left in tears because we were outnumbered and had nothing, and suddenly kind of realized that not only do we have nothing, but I won't be believed if they are even brave enough to go with me. Where will I take them? I have nothing set up. What was I thinking? Yeah. And so I spent my next day, which was my last day in Bangkok, firing off all these emails to local organizations, begging them to come back to this place and find these girls. And they did follow up, and they were no longer there, right? And so, but in that, I also sent an email to my best friend, and we talk about this to this day of how I was feeling. Like my first kind of download on all of the emotions of the moment, and saying, I will never be in this position again. I will do something about this industry. Yeah. And so a year and a half later, I was in DC taking a job at Shared Hope.
Hey, Masculine Wilderness podcast listeners, this is Lauren, your producer. If you found value in our show, we've got an epic opportunity for you. Become an epic ally today and join our fight against human trafficking. Your monthly support not only keeps this podcast going, but also fuels our mission to protect the vulnerable and combat exploitation. For less than one coffee a week, you can make a real difference. Head on over to epicproject.org and choose an amount that works for you. Even $13 a month can change lives. By becoming an Epic ally, you're not just supporting the podcast, you're joining a movement. Stand with us. Let's make an impact together. Thank you.
I think it's so helpful to hear what you said, though, about you feel that impulse, you feel the rage, you feel, the indignation that people are suffering, but you can't just go storming in there and, to try to save the day. I'm going to come back to that thread in a little bit, but so you came to Shared Hope. What year was that?
2009. So it's been this spring, this March makes 16 years. Wow. In the field. I know.
So what have you seen changes, good or bad, since then? Because in this work, it's a couple of lifetimes, I think. Mm-hmm. But what are some of the big changes, big trends that you've seen, either helpful or not so helpful during that time?
There are very few people at this point who I think can adequately answer that are still in the field, because a lot of us who were started back then have evolved in other positions. So, and evolution is a word I like to use when it comes to the movement, because the anti-trafficking movement has evolved substantially and largely as survivors have risen up to share their lived experiences in such a thoughtful way that it now informs our response and allows us as allies and other professionals to be more thoughtful, more trauma-informed, and frankly, more strategic. So I've always said, and I would continue to say, that the field is going to evolve, and as it should. And we who consider ourselves leaders in this space have what I would say like a mantle of responsibility to either captain that evolution or support it, right? So get on board or don't, but if anyone's watching the revolution or the evolution from the sidelines and they're digging their heels in without any desire to change, then those people are undermining their own mission to be a part of this. And so but there were things that we did in the field 16 years ago and 10 years ago that we used to do that I would now say gently were harmful, right? They weren't intended to be harmful, but they were. And over time, we learned that they were harmful to survivors or just harmful to the entire field as a whole in general. So we had the opportunity to change, and many organizations did. Some did not, but it really comes down to the notion at the most basic level. Are you willing to change your culture, your leadership practices, your programs, your marketing and fundraising tactics when you realize or when you get feedback that there's a better way to do it? Are you willing to make those intentional changes when best or better or promising practices emerge in the field? And if you are not, you are undermining your own mission. So I have seen that, right? I remember there's a quote from Oprah that I pulled a long time ago that said, we can't become what we need to be by remaining what we are. And I really take that to heart, because it comes to especially when it comes to the why behind our work. Our work in this field is specifically to do everything we can to either end or prevent exploitation and to create pathways out of it and into healing for every individual. So that's the nutshell of what we do. And I've been around long enough to see significant strides in that. So as survivors have contributed their voices, we've seen changes in language and communications, the way we discuss exploitation, how we speak about survivors in particular.
Can you give a couple examples of that?
So there's somebody that I've known for a long time, and I won't name his name, but he's a real good example of somebody who just kind of dug in his heels. So he was a cop, and then he retired and went on to do other things, and he would continue to say victim. Even as a really kind, generous contributor to our field, up until even 2 years ago, he would just continue to say victim. There's a victim speaking at our event. We're going to have a victim testimony. And I called him out on it so many times. Why are you doing this? Like, that we stopped that term a long time ago. When you're a victim, and you're being trafficked, yes. And he said, well, I was a cop, and that's what we said, and that's what cops recognize. And like, how many people have to how many survivors do you need to say, please stop using this term, especially in a position of leadership in front of a group of people? Like, if we can't even do simplified changes to language, right? But then I would say, like, all the discussion around ethical storytelling. So how we gather and tell stories as a whole in our marketing and fundraising tactics. 15 and 16 years ago, nobody was listening, right? They didn't believe it. The numbers weren't there. There was a desperation. And so we took these horrible stories and we used them. Like, listen to this. Does this not impact you? Does this not make you want to be a part of it? And it did, right? It absolutely did. But over time, as we realized, we took those stories and our efforts to create change, and we realized that that person whose story we took without asking and without permission to use it publicly to raise money and awareness and use it in trainings, like, we re-exploited them, right? Yeah. And that's a hard pill to swallow when that's not your intent. And so we often can get like a little offended by, well, that wasn't my intent. Yeah, that's fine. I appreciate that it wasn't your intent, but the impact of your actions created harm, and we still have to take responsibility for that. So, and there are some organizations that will still use extremely sensational marketing tactics.
Yeah.
So language and communications, I would say data, like the amount and the quality of data, the methods of and how we collect data, how we share data, how we define success in areas, best practices around that, that has changed. Who's at the table? And Tom, I know you can speak to this a lot. Like, when we started, it was just a handful of survivors back then, and a bunch of social workers. And then with dedicated like awareness and training campaigns.
Zealots like you and me.
Yeah. Impulse-driven people. But over time, it became an MDT response that involves like all sectors of society. And then over time, it evolved even more to really honor and intentionally prioritize survivor inclusion and leadership at those tables, which has been awesome. Legislation, you and I in our early days, we were part of an organization, Shared Hope, really drove the needle forward. Legislation, so did Polaris and a few other organizations. So tons of laws have changed or been amended. Funding has changed. So state and federal entities have prioritized funding for these issues. Stigmas, that's a huge one, right? Our shift in perceptions about victims as a whole paved the way for our shifts and perceptions about perpetrators. So back when we started, when you and I both got into this field, a lot of the like emerging research, and Shared Hope was a part of that on the domestic issue, time and again, we found like the ages of victims, regardless of how old the victim was, there's this perception about, in particular, I can say with sex trafficking, prostitution. And so you're still a prostitute. It doesn't matter if you were 9, 10, or 11, you're on the street trading sex for money, you're a prostitute. And so the unintentional harm it was causing because people hadn't shifted their language, but they also hadn't shifted the stigma related to victimization. So victims were arrested and charged with crimes, and they were the low-hanging fruit. They weren't going after the pimps, yes and no, but they definitely weren't going after the buyers.
Right.
So as things emerged and research came about, then we started to see a shift. I remember, there was a study in Las Vegas 20 years ago where in 2 years, this was a Shared Hope report, in 2 years of research, it was 226 kids under 18, right, from 28 different states in those 2 years were arrested and charged with prostitution-related offenses in Vegas. That wouldn't happen a day, right? But it did then. And so in the 9 years prior to that study, there were almost 1,500 kids arrested. And so I highlight this because it was so common to just arrest our way out of victimization, regardless of somebody's ideas, but they didn't know how to respond. And so...
But they weren't arresting buyers. They were just busy arresting kids. Yeah.
That's absolutely right. And so over time, like as the stigmas around victimization shifted, then naturally kind of the next domino was like, okay, if we can change our tune to how we view these people who are the victims, then it highlights who the perpetrators are, and not just this perpetrator, but also this perpetrator, right? And so the shift is there.
So you're describing like you said, an evolutionary trajectory. And I've seen many of those same things. I think you've seen them more up close than I have because of the nature of what you do. But that's actually a really hopeful picture. Like, okay, this movement, this work is growing. People are understanding the issue at a deeper level. What is still left? Like, what are the changes that you think still need to happen? Maybe not just in the movement, but maybe more broadly within the culture.
Oh, that's a tricky question. I still think we've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. There's a lot of discussion right now between the pro-sex works movement and then, the anti-trafficking field. And there's a lot of overlap in what these two areas of cultural shift want. And I think that overlap is what's interesting to me as a whole, because we can all say that we understand that what gets somebody to a place of being involved in particularly the commercial sex industry, there's a whole journey. They didn't just show up today and decide to do this. There were a lot of factors that were involved, like one way or the other. And arresting a person for this is not solving any of those reasons that they arrived in this place today. And so this push around avoiding or shifting away from arresting, again, still like victims, even though it was an issue that was happening much more prevalently 20 years ago, it's still happening today because some of those perceptions still exist. And so there's some of that. I would say the labor trafficking and exploitation, a lot of the hot button issues that are happening today, they all feed into vulnerabilities related to trafficking, but understanding how people end up in situations, in particular labor trafficking. I feel like we've said this for years in the field, that it's far less sensational per se than the sex trafficking aspect is, because it's not salacious. And so it doesn't captivate the mind as much, but the vulnerabilities that are there exist, and the conditions in which people are trafficked for labor purposes are horrendous.
And they overlap with sexual exploitation too. Yeah,
they absolutely do. And then, so there's that. And then we continue to have a hard time as a society understanding the victimization of men and boys. And so I think, and then LGBTQ populations as well. And so I think that there are some shifts that are happening that I'm happy to see, but it's still tireless work. It's almost just kind of knocking on doors constantly per se, like in a figurative sense of going, this is an issue, like, and can we see it? And can we not just, if we can't see it, it's because there's also not enough research and prioritization of revealing the truth behind these things. Yeah. So I think the priorities I'm hopeful that we'll eventually get there.
I want people to know too that you have this perspective in large part because a lot of your work has come from dealing directly and providing training directly to law enforcement. How many, ballpark figure, over your career, how many law enforcement professionals have you trained and presented to?
Oh boy. That is a great question, because it would kind of, an over-analysis of this, because it would take into account, the work that I do now is not necessarily specifically all of the trainings that I used to do. So prior to working for myself, I did an extensive amount of training. And then I built national training conferences. Well, I still do national training conferences, but I'm not the front runner trainer, but I'm part of educating the population. So, I don't know. I know that my numbers when I left Shared
More than 100?
Oh yeah. Hundreds for sure. So yeah, when I left Shared Hope, I think I was like teetering up on 1,700 that I could calculate professionals that I had trained, which is not a ton really. No, it can't be that. That can't be right, because it was 150 trainings, and it was thousands. I can't remember. It's in my bio somewhere. I'm like, was it over?
I'm pretty sure.
I think it was over 6,000 people. Yeah. I know there was a 6 in there somewhere.
I set you up a little bit. I kind of knew that there was more to it. So of that, let's say 6,000.
Of that, I would say not less than 20%, right? Like I did law enforcement were in almost every audience that I ever trained. And then there were some law enforcement specific events that I did in training. And then I'm not the direct trainer. I wasn't over the Just Conference, right? But building training opportunities for law enforcement, which I continue to do. So I run a conference. I co-host a conference in the Rockies region that is a multidisciplinary conference, and a huge component of what we cater to are law enforcement as well.
Yeah. So you have, the reason I'm asking the question is you have been in that space, and I know law enforcement isn't exclusively men, but it tends to be dominated by, and I'm speaking as a guy, by the kind of guys that civilians, when they think about this issue, like, we want to be that guy, the guy with the badge and the gun that goes and gets the bad guy, and from my civilian perspective, like, that's who law enforcement is. They get to do that hard, gritty, I would think it's rewarding work. But part of the problem with that for most men, because most men are not law enforcement, is it reinforces, and I'm going back to this is a conversation you and I had a few years ago, it reinforces what I call the action hero narrative that a lot of men fall into when they hear about trafficking, when they read books like the one you mentioned by Victor Malarick and others, and you've done more of that. I want to come back to that as well. But when we read these stories, we want to do something. And as men, we're trained to, just aggression and, force and violence. And we want to bring all of that to bear on this issue because we see, we see the suffering. But the action hero narrative, the problem with that, and there was a movie that triggered a ton of conversation, and it was really helpful, I think, because it got people talking. And it's called The Sound of Freedom, came out a few years ago. And I think I want to give it credit for stimulating a lot of conversation. But the other problem with that, and it's not unique to that, to that film, is creates this idea for men that if you're a man and you want to make a difference in this space, you got to be the action hero, and if you're not, then there's really nothing for you to do. How have you seen that kind of dynamic play out? Because we had a conversation about that when the movie came out a few summers ago. I remember talking with you, and you actually you got me a little more regulated over it because I was just really angry at what this was doing and, the story it was telling. And you said, and this is a paraphrase, but what I remember you kind of nudging me on was that, the impulse to do something is not a bad thing. And we don't want to, snuff out that impulse in anybody, especially men. But can you just talk a little bit more about, like, how do you, when you're not speaking to cops with the badge and the gun, when you're speaking to men, when you're doing work, like the work that you're doing now, how do you approach men who want to do something useful in this kind of work?
I'll be honest, I don't have the pleasure of having those conversations as much, but what I often tell people when it comes to the trafficking stuff is what I learned early on. Well, let me back up and preface this by saying when I joined the field, it felt like, and it very much true, that there were no opportunities for you to be an active part of this if you weren't a social worker, a mental health therapist, or a cop, right? There weren't job opportunities in this field at that
much
time.
less volunteer opportunities.
Right. Absolutely. And so, there was just so much has changed. And so I think as time evolved things evolve very quickly, we realized that we need all types of people to be involved into care. And then as I grew in my knowledge and understanding of all of the systemic, societal, like the community-based issues that feed into trafficking, it led me as in my work-life balance, right, to become a mentor to a kid in my neighborhood who was coming to a community-based organization. I was really impressed by the statistical change and vulnerability from a kid who has a stable adult in their lives, whether or not it's their parent. Like, one stable parent will reduce your vulnerabilities, increase your resilience and like potential exponentially. But even just having a stable adult, period, changes the trajectory of your life, right? And if I could offer that stability in my free time, even just mentoring a kid 1 hour a week, like, again, the statistics are unbelievable. And we all have an hour a week we can give our time to something. So whenever people would desperately go, what can I do? And it's like, when there weren't all these volunteer opportunities for a trafficking organization, do you want to go stuff letters? Okay. I would, whatever, fold t-shirts, like, nobody cares. What I would rather you do with the time that you have is actually not trafficking specific. And that's hard for people to grasp when they think, but I want to fight trafficking. And I said, the best way you can fight trafficking is to mentor a kid. Like,
that's so good.
That is the best way you can fight trafficking, or help single moms, or disadvantaged, like women or people who are escaping domestic violence, people who are living in shelters. You being the stable person in any person's life who's going through a crisis will change the trajectory of their lives because it offers them hope, right? And hope is a tremendous thing. Like how we respond in a sea of darkness when there's one tiny ray of hope, we fight for what that hope means for us. So instead of just giving up and succumbing, and that's scientifically proven in all kinds of studies on rats and whatever, right? But the point is, we're wired to move towards the light. We're wired to move towards hope. And we as everyday people can do the simplest things. And I think it's mind-blowing that we all just kind of overlook those. And the mentoring agencies or the community-based groups in your community are desperate for volunteers. My organization, we didn't need volunteers at all. Stop calling us. Go do this, right?
Yeah.
But people are like, but I want to work on track. No, but you are. And it's your bias that prevents you from seeing that. And so if we want to talk about not just like what can people do, but the things
Wait, so you're saying men don't have to be action heroes to make a difference?
Thank you, Tom, for coming back full circle. That is what I'm saying. Yeah. But you are the action hero. You're just not the hero in the profile that you imagine. But for that person, you are still a hero in their life, right? Yeah. What I encourage men especially to do is using that like truly God-given, like world, universe, Mother Earth, whatever you want to say, given like leadership potential and strength and energy that is wired within you, like the gift that you have to give, then share it freely with the people who need it most.
So that would apply then to even coaching a youth baseball team.
Love it. Yeah.
Youth sports.
Absolutely. Especially in a day and age when I've seen some men who are terrible coaches and like tearing down people as of like, because that was what they learned was appropriate to do. Don't be that guy, right? Yeah. Like be the guy who builds, who care. I mean, yes, I'm a competitive person. I care about who wins the game. But at the end of the day, does winning that game make you a stronger, like healthier, better person in the world? No. But the person who talks to you about like all of the leadership aspects of the sport you're playing and collaboration and communication with your team, what are we looking for? Are we looking for, does winning make you a better person? Or do all of these soft skills that come along with being on a team make you a better person? And that's what a coach should be drawing out, right?
That's great.
So
that's great.
Anyway, says the girl who's never coached a sports team in her life.
Well, the diehard Saints fan, you know what that's all about.
Know.
You're such a deep thinker, not just about the issue of, all the nuances of trafficking and policy and law enforcement training, but I've enjoyed watching kind of the evolutionary growth of your own leadership in this. And one of the things you've done recently is this book guide. Tell us about that, because tell us about the book guide. It's on your website. It's just a helpful tool, but tell us a little bit about that, because I think it's the latest expression of the way Elizabeth Scaife shows up in this space. Tell us about that.
Well, you're referencing Books by Survivors, which is the largest compilation of survivor-authored books ever produced or released, and I'm very excited to put it out into the world. It's a gift from my heart, really, is what it is. Now, it's a free resource, obviously. And it's downloadable. It's a big file. But the high resolution copy is there for anyone who wants to download it. And it is my effort to elevate and amplify, I think, the most important voices in our field. Right. And so when I look back on what information was available to us 20 years ago, there are a handful of survivors that I can think of right off the bat that had been working tirelessly in this field, but their stories weren't in books. And so my journey into this field came from a book that I read that shared some of the really horrible stories. And I don't advocate for that, right? But it was that book that spoke the truth. It wasn't fiction. It was nonfiction. And that altered my life forever. Thank you, Victor, if you're still with us. But over time, we went from investigative journalists, which were the only books 20 years ago and 15 years ago, into survivors who over time began to bravely find ways to share their stories without publishing companies, right? and without funding and backing, but to do the work, hard work, to put their voice in print and the courageous work of releasing it. And we know that not everybody has nice things to say when you open yourself up for book reviews on Amazon, but so many people. And so watching my friends put their voices and their books and their stories out into the world a few years back, I just, it was Human Trafficking Awareness Month. And I thought, you know what? Everybody's talking about all these other resources. I just want to put something out that highlights survivor books. And so I did, and the response was overwhelmingly positive. And at that time, I think I had identified around 20 books, something along those lines. And I was collecting them on my own. And then since then, I have continued to intentionally collect as they have debuted, and with the intention of producing an actual resource, not just like a social media post, but an actual resource. And I'll tell you what, Tom, like over the last, I want to say 4 or 5 years that I've been collecting, I finally sat down to do this resource because I wanted to launch it. Honestly, I wanted to launch it before Cyber Monday last year. And then, of course, leading into January for Human Trafficking Awareness Month. But I wanted to get it out for Cyber Monday so that as people invested in Christmas books or whatever, that they would intentionally do it. So I finally sat down and did it. It probably took, I don't even know. I mean, it's my own time, right? But I want to say it took me at least 100 hours of design work and linking and all the things. But yeah, so we came up with, I think I'm at, what was it, 98 books by 89 survivors.
I was going to ask you, how many currently on the list? I think
that's what it was. I just put out the first edition, and then I got a few more recommended or identified for me. And so I updated it and re-released it in January. I think it was 98 books by 89 survivors, which is...
Why is it, aside from the fact that many of these folks are your friends, I know that, but why are their stories so important?
I mean, frankly, this is how we develop best practices, learning from and in collaboration with the individuals who are the most impacted by our practices and by the field as a whole. This is how we develop best practices. So if allies such as ourselves are overshadowing the voices of survivors, then we are undermining our allyship, and that should never happen. So this is how we learn.
Does that tendency to overshadow survivors in this work still crop up from time to time? Do you still see it?
Yeah, and I don't think it's, for the most part, I don't think it's intentional. Like, I don't think anybody ever, I mean, what kind of person, right? I'm sure there are those people, but what kind of person really says, you know what, I'm tired of hearing from them, I'm going to put my stuff out there. But I think it's we as professionals, we've invested in our own careers and knowledge and all these things that we put out resources I think we should be proud of. But I don't think that, I think we have to be careful of what our agenda is and ask the hard questions always. What is my agenda? And if I bring on a survivor and I'm crafting a contract, and I've offered this objective perspective to a lot of wonderful organizations who are super survivor informed, but when you dig into like the nuances of like a marketing contract or something like permission to use your image and likeness and story, then they don't even recognize that there are even just like tiny little strings that if I pull them a little too hard, it reveals that this contract is set up to benefit you. And in doing so, you, in my opinion, are actually undermining like who you say you are and your DNA as an organization. You don't mean to take advantage of this. You're just looking out for your own self, right? You're looking out for your own interests and protecting yourself. But if we're really about protecting survivors, it needs to show up in all the ways that what we do. So this marketing contract should actually go above and beyond, in my opinion, above and beyond to protect this person. You can protect both, but you should extra protect this person's rights and rights to change their mind in a year or 5 years if they don't want you to use their likeness and image anymore and stuff like that. So I'm kind of like getting into the weeds of it on your question, but I think when we ask ourselves, where does my agenda overshadow the voice of this person, then we have to look at all facets of that. And it's not easy, which is why you get consultants like me and you who kind of come along and offer a balanced perspective. So
I have made the mistake several times because I am slow that way, but of reading some of these stories, like sometimes in one sitting, sometimes when I'm not in the head space and the heart space to really absorb and process effectively this trauma. You've obviously, you read more than I have, but what advice can you give to people that say, I want to hear her story? Because this is not like reading a a book about best places to fly fish in the Rocky Mountains. This is not that. What's your advice to people that want to read these stories?
It's hard. It's hard to land on the right point of advice. I think each book's a little different. Some books people write books at different times in their lives. And so it could be early on in their personal or professional journey as an author, or it could be much later in life. And so what's reflected in the book itself is going to vary on a spectrum. Some books are written to be sort of memoirs. This was my gritty experience, and it was cathartic for them to put it out there. Some people, it's a tool to help serve and support survivors and stuff. And so I'd say when you're asking yourself, which books should I read, or I would say, first of all, I'd say buy all the books, because it just builds your library and support survivors in that way.
Yeah.
If you're looking at which books am I ready to dig into, then I think you need to ask yourself, am I here for education? Do I want to know what entails labor and sex trafficking? Do I want to know the tools in this? And then start kind of narrowing down. It is hard. I've been in this field for 16 years. I think I own 42 trafficking books, and 28 of them are survivor books. I own them, but I haven't read them all. Why not? Well, because sometimes when you work on this issue all day, you don't want to sit down at night with your dessert and read this.
Yeah.
And so I think knowing that there's the right time to dig into a hard story. These are not fiction stories, right? So knowing that you're going to read something that's heart-wrenching, and it's not sensational, it's not fake, it's not an escape, it's a journey, then you do have to take it in stride and be in the right frame of mind and the right mindset, and know that a lot of these books are not perfectly written. They're not professionally edited or professionally published or any of that stuff. Some of it's really gritty.
Yeah.
And some of it kind of goes all over the place, but that's not why you're reading it, right? You're reading it to support survivors. So
yeah, and I've read enough of them, and I have enough survivor friends, and have had enough conversations. Often my experience when I read them is that reading the book is often like talking to the survivor. It can feel kind of scattered because they're jumping around and touching on different things, and I think some of that is this is my amateur assessment of it. Some of that is a reflection of, they're speaking from their trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And trauma is not neat and clean and linear, and it doesn't get wrapped up in a bow at the end, right? It can be really ragged and messy. I think the reason I ask that is I don't want people to, wade into this unaware. It is, if you have any compassion at all, it is difficult to think about it and to wrestle with it. And it's not something you cozy up by the fire with a big piece of pie and some whatever at night to read. It's not that kind of book. It'll affect you.
Yeah.
So you do this work. I know you well enough. You feel the weight of it. What do you do when you're not doing that stuff that is life-giving and restorative, besides returning to New Orleans to eat really good food? Because I know that's part of your rhythm too.
No matter what I tell myself, as soon as I step off that plane and that French bread hits you in the face, Tom, all my resolve to eat healthy all week goes out the window. You're right. That's exactly what happens. But I am a Louisiana girl, so I do love to cook. Believe it or not, cooking is very cathartic for me. But that's not what I do to necessarily balance my life. These days, I'm an avid traveler. I'm a super adventurous girl. And so getting out into the world, I'll never give up on that. But I also just really love being outdoors. And so there's obviously it's research has shown what the impact of being outdoors in nature, in the sunshine or whatnot, challenging your body to all the things, what it does for your health benefits. And so that's why it feels so good. So I do that. But I also have taken up a little pickleball. So I am a fierce competitor, trash talking pickleball.
I did not see that coming.
I'll challenge you any day, Tom.
Well, it's not much of a challenge with me. Yeah. Speaking of getting outside, you did that more than most. You hiked the Camino. briefly?
Actually, I don't even know if you know this. So I did the first half. I leave in 2 months to do the rest of it. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think when we were last together, when I saw you in DC, it was right before then, the first time.
Was it? Is
I
that that long ago? It's been a year and a half.
Yeah. Yeah.
Jeez.
Yeah. So you're doing the second.
I'm doing the second half. Yeah.
Wow. So the Camino, I have not done it. All I know is the Camino. What's
incredible.
the full? It's
the
a
Camino
pilgrimage.
De Santiago. It is considered. I mean, it was founded and designed and became right. It's a pilgrimage. It's meant to be a spiritual pilgrimage. It doesn't have to be spiritual in that sense for everybody, but it is a spiritual experience that is unavoidable. And whether you consider yourself a spiritual person or not is irrelevant. It is inherently an experience that combines like physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. It is the intersection of everything, which it's wild. It was always an adventure that I wanted to do, but I didn't, and you can't. It's one of those things that you think you know what you're getting into, but it's so much more and also so much less, but not less as in it's less than the experience I wanted. It's simpler and also yet more profound than anything I've ever done in my life. And I've done a lot of great things.
It's hundreds of miles through
500 miles. Yeah.
Wow.
About, yeah.
So when will you go again?
So we have our annual GRIT conference, which will promote everybody listening here. Phenomenal multidisciplinary conference coming up in Bozeman the last week of April. And I fly back, hopefully without COVID or anything else, pack my stuff, and I'm gone May 4th for the rest of my journey. Yeah.
That's awesome. That does sound life-giving. I want to give you, as is our custom, give you the last word, and I want to set it up just a little bit. What would you say to maybe younger versions of me, men who care, who want to show up in a healthy way to make a difference? What's your advice to men who want to see this pattern of exploitation and trauma and all of that, to see it noticeably diminished in our lifetime? What would you say to men?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say that in general, you have to take your perception from what you must or need or should do to change trafficking from here down to here. Like if we take it from this big thing down to ground level, then it is as simple as like learning to love follow me on this. Like you would love yourself so much that you would be self-aware and cognizant and dedicated daily to the internal work that we need to do as people that make us healthier individuals, like inside and outside. And also in conjunction with that, as you focus on working on yourself daily, every day, and don't think that you don't have to, we all do, right? That healing that we experience, which is for the betterment of ourselves, also gives us an understanding of the healing process and empathy towards the healing process of everyone around us, which then makes us better allies, better and kinder humans, and more empathetic and less offended by the behaviors that we see on a daily basis, which also contributes to being less offended by the behaviors and kind of the nature of someone who has been so injured and exploited and abused by society in a trafficking situation, that they won't disclose, they reject assistance, they won't speak out against their trafficker. They won't, there are a lot of things people think when, trafficking is horrible, that person's a victim. They will act like a victim. They will tell me what's wrong and I will rescue them. There's this idea, again, back to this whole really simplistic view of what it means to be hurt and abused and then taken out of an abusive situation. And quite frankly, it is almost never that way in this field. And so if we're doing the work and also saying that we want to be a part of the solution, then it does involve all of these things. Like it involves being less discriminatory against those who are most vulnerable to trafficking. Traffickers don't discriminate, Tom, right? But we do. We in society do. And so in a time like now, which is really politically charged, and there are all these competing messages around the people who are most vulnerable in society right now, then be on the good guy's side, right? Which is the more empathetic, the kinder, the more human experience of it. Because if you cannot identify with the pain of someone else's human experience, then you have deafened your ears and allowed blind spots to take over your vision. Then you're not contributing to the solutions, you're contributing to the problems, right? And so as for men, especially, now is more than ever a time that I would say that we in society worldwide, but in particular the United States, who I believe this podcast appeals to, we need men who are willing to stand beside us, those of us who are vulnerable to being attacked, vulnerable to being exploited, vulnerable to being injured, and those who are vulnerable to being abused and who've already been abused. In a lot of ways in society, we need people who are willing to say, hey, that shouldn't happen to you. Or I'm sorry you went through that, or I want to help prevent this from getting worse. And so that work starts internally, right? And then also will bleed over into all of your relationships. And so the more grounded I have found in my own life, like the more grounded I am, the more centered I am in working through all of my junk, then by far the better friend, and human I am to everyone around me. So I no longer am reactive to what they're going through. I'm actually the secure. I create the safety because I've done the work on myself, right? So the focus is no longer on all the dynamics. The focus is now on creating safety and security for that person to then have the safety and security to, I guess, speak their truth, right? Does that make sense?
It does. And it feels like, listening to it as a man, it feels like something I can do. That's doable. I don't have to be an action hero.
You don't want to be an action hero.
No. Elizabeth Scaife, you speak like an elder because you are one. Still a puppy, but I'm really grateful for you. So thank you.
Tom, thank you for being here. You might not be technically my oldest friend in the field, but you're definitely probably in the top 5. But what I would say above and beyond about Tom Perez is that you are one of the most humble people I have ever known in my life. And you are a fierce advocate for every human, but especially for women. And you create naturally, because of who you are, you create space for everyone to have a voice, right? And so that whatever space I take up, you are not the person who ever sees my taking space, meaning you get less space, right? You always just naturally allow for those of us to have as much space as we want in your presence. And I've never felt that I had to minimize myself for your benefit or your ego or any of that. And I don't think that you recognize or would ever know, because you are just you, right? How powerful that is for everyone around you.
That's deeply meaningful.
So, thank you.
Thanks, friend. That's great.